Matthew 16, Shattering the Defensive Gates. The green light of the digital projector cast a pale glow over the tiered rows of the lecture hall, illuminating 40 open laptops in the heavy silence of an afternoon slump. At the front of the room, Professor Arthur Vance adjusted his glasses and swept a dry erase eraser across the whiteboard, obliterating a complex, marker-smudged timeline of first-century Galilee. He stopped near the far right corner, his hand hovering over the scribbled notes for their mid-semester curriculum. "We have spent weeks tracking this royal narrative at high speed," Vance said, turning to face the class as he set the eraser down on the metal tray. "We watched the lineage established in the opening chapters, analyzed the ethical manifesto of the Mount, and just last session, we unraveled the desperate, exhausted detours of chapters 14 and 15, where thousands were fed on foreign shores. The syllabus says we push straight into the Transfiguration today, but if we do that, we are going to commit the academic sin of rushing past the most explosive structural pivot in the entire first gospel. We need to slow the clock down. Open your texts to chapter 16. In the front row, Ethan adjusted his notebook, his pen poised with the clinical precision of a pre-law track. Are we looking at a shift in geography or a shift in the nature of the opposition? Both, Vance said, pacing the length of the platform. It begins with an adversarial alliance that shouldn't exist. The Pharisees and Sadducees, theological and political blood enemies, unite down partisan lines for the sole purpose of testing him. They want a sign from heaven. They can forecast the weather by looking at the evening sky, yet they are completely blind to the macroclimate of the Messianic era staring them in the face. And what does he give them? The sign of Jonah. Nothing more. But look at what happens when they cross the lake. He turns to the disciples and gives a warning that the Berean Standard Bible and the New American Standard frame with absolute urgency. Beware of the leaven of these leaders. Ethan leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he scanned his screen. The disciples thought he was talking about literal bread because they forgot the leftovers from the 5,000 and the 4,000. But what is the actual mechanism of the leaven here? It isn't a simple rule-breaking mindset, Ethan, Vance said, stopping to point a finger toward the ceiling. The Amplified Bible expands it to mean their corruptive doctrine and systemic legalism. Leaven changes the structural composition of the whole loaf from the inside out, silently. It is an institutional contagion. And to counter an institutional contagion, you don't just offer individual advice, you build a counter-institution. That is why the narrative immediately shifts north, far outside the jurisdiction of Jerusalem, into the territory of Caesarea Philippi. The projector screen clicked, displaying a high-resolution photograph of a massive, monolithic limestone cliff face carved with ancient, empty niches. At the base of the rock, a dark, yawning cavern mouth swallowed the light. "Imagine standing there," Vance murmured, his voice dropping into a resonant, quiet tone that made the typing in the back rows stop. "This is a landscape dominated by shrines to Pan and imperial temples dedicated to the divinity of Caesar. It is a city built on pagan cults and political propaganda. In front of this specific cliff, which local lore called the mouth of the underworld, Jesus drops the ultimate diagnostic question. Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? They throw out the public opinion polls, John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah. It is safe, historical categorization. But then he narrows the focus, forces it into the present tense, and asks the core group, but who do you say that I am? Ethan tapped his pen against his desk, and Simon speaks up. The English Standard Version and the New King James both capture that raw, singular confession. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. It's an ideological declaration of war against every shrine in that cliffside. Exactly, Vance said, his eyes flashing behind his lenses as he stepped toward the board. And look at the judicial response. Jesus doesn't just commend his faith, he changes his name and lays down a structural blueprint. He tells him, you are Peter, Petros, a solitary stone or a detached fragment, and upon this Petra, this massive, monolithic bedrock cliff of the divine truth you just confessed, I will build my Ekklesia. Vance picked up a piece of black marker and wrote the Greek letters boldly across the clean white surface, K-L-E-C-R. We have translated that word as church for centuries, Vance continued, leaning against the lecture podium, but to a first-century ear, it carried zero religious sentimentality. If you were a citizen in Athens or Ephesus, the Ekklesia was the summoned assembly of active citizens called out from their private residences into the public square to handle the legal, legislative, and governmental business of the city-state. Young's literal translation restores this by using the word assembly. Jesus isn't founding a quiet, inward-looking monastery or a weekly synagogue club. He is issuing a sovereign civic mandate. He is establishing an alternative embassy of the cosmos, vested with legislative authority, and he declares that the gates of Hades will not overpower it. Ethan looked up from his notes, his legal training kicking in. Professor, if we look at the mechanics of ancient defense, gates don't move, they don't march. If the gates of death aren't overpowering the assembly, that means the assembly is the one doing the marching. Precisely, Vance said, striking the board with his knuckles. The traditional Western mindset has inverted the text, painting a picture of a terrified church huddled behind a wall, trying to survive a demonic siege. But gates are inherently defensive structures. They hold things in, or they bar things out. Jesus is casting his assembly as an invading administrative force, storming the fortresses of death, sin, and systemic corruption. And those ancient ironclad doors do not possess the structural integrity to withstand the kingdom's advance. He follows this up by handing over the keys of the kingdom. It is rabbinic legislative vocabulary. Whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. The assembly is authorized to ratify on earth the judicial decrees already established in the heavenly courts. The classroom was entirely still now, the hum of the air conditioner the only baseline to the lecture. Vance paused, letting the legislative weight of the Ekklesia hang in the air before his expression darkened, shifting with the narrative arc of the text itself. But here is the ultimate whiplash of Matthew 16, Vance said quietly, stepping back to his desk. From that exact moment, once the royal identity and the institutional blueprint are secure, Jesus turns their understanding of power upside down. He reveals that the sovereign king must go to Jerusalem to suffer at the hands of the elders, be executed, and be raised on the third day. Peter, still riding the high of his new promotion, pulls Jesus aside to rebuke him, telling him this must never happen, and the response is a stinging, unvarnished correction. Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block because your mind is set on human ambitions, not the things of God. Ethan leaned back, shaking his head slightly. To go from being called the rock of the assembly to being called an adversary in the span of 3 verses is an incredible demotion. It is the cost of citizenship in this new assembly, Ethan, Vance said, picking up his open Bible from the desk and reading directly from the text. The Berean standard, the Christian standard, even the literalism of Darby and Young all converge on this unyielding economy of discipleship in verse 24. If anyone wants to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. The cross wasn't a piece of jewelry then. It was an instrument of state-sponsored execution. To find your life, you have to lose it in the service of the king. The currency of this Ekklesia is total self-relinquishment. The sharp, rhythmic clang of the campus tower bell broke the silence of the room, signaling the end of the hour. Vance closed his Bible with a soft thud and looked out at the rows of students who sat momentarily frozen, suspended between the ancient gravity of Caesarea Philippi and the immediate reality of their next classes. That is all the time we can afford to give this, Vance said, his voice returning to its brisk, lecturing cadence as he picked up the eraser once more. We have a mountain of material to cover if we're going to stay on schedule, so we need to pick up the pace on Thursday, do the required reading tonight, and let's see if we can finally get into the Gospel of Mark by next week. The spell broke. Laptops clicked shut, zipper pulls rattled against backpacks, and the collective shuffle of 80 feet moving toward the aisles filled the lecture hall. Vance turned his back to the departing crowd, his eyes tracking the bold Greek letters on the board for a final second before he swept the eraser across the lines, clearing the space for whoever was coming in next.